In the northern plains of a quiet region called Stonebridge Valley, there was an old railway line that most people had completely forgotten. It cut across the land like a long scar. Miles of rusted steel tracks stretched through empty fields, broken wooden stations, and abandoned warehouses that had slowly been taken over by weeds. Decades earlier, the railway had once been the most important transportation route in the valley. Freight trains carried grain, lumber, and livestock between distant cities. Small towns grew along the tracks. Shops opened near the stations. Hotels welcomed travelers passing through. For a time, the railway had been the lifeline of the entire region. But then everything changed. New highways were built across the valley. Large trucking companies replaced most freight trains. And over time, the old railway slowly lost its importance. Train schedules became less frequent. Stations closed one by one. Businesses moved closer to the highways. Eventually, the railway stopped operating entirely. The trains never returned. The stations were locked, and the tracks were left behind. For the next 20 years, the railway remained exactly where it was, stretching across the valley, unused and slowly fading into the landscape. Most people barely noticed it anymore. The land around the tracks became cheap. Investors ignored it. Developers preferred building near the busy highways instead. To them, the railway belonged to the past. But one man saw something different. His name was Lucas Mercer. Lucas was not a wealthy businessman. He was a small land investor who had spent years studying how towns developed around transportation routes. He understood something that many people overlooked. Throughout history, towns had always formed around movement. Roads, ports, railways, airports. Wherever transportation created connection, people eventually followed. And Lucas believed the abandoned Stonebridge Railway might not be as useless as everyone thought. Because while the railway itself was silent, the cities at both ends of the valley were growing rapidly. Factories were expanding, population was increasing, and freight transportation demand was slowly rising again. Lucas had been studying transportation reports for months. Quietly, carefully, and one detail kept appearing in the reports again and again. The government was considering restoring several older rail routes across the region to support industrial shipping. Nothing had been officially announced yet. Most people had no idea the discussion was even happening. But Lucas realized something important. If the railway ever reopened, the land along those tracks would instantly become valuable again. Not just valuable, essential. That thought stayed with him for weeks. One afternoon, Lucas drove his truck along a dusty road running parallel to the abandoned railway. The sun was setting across the valley, casting long shadows across the rusted tracks. Grass grew between the rails. An old station building stood in the distance, its wooden walls faded and broken. Most people would have seen decay. Lucas saw potential. Because land along the railway was almost unbelievably cheap. No developers wanted it. No investors were interested. Entire sections of property were sitting unsold for years. That night, Lucas sat at his kitchen table, studying maps of the valley. Railway routes, industrial zones, population growth charts. The more he studied, the more one idea became clearer. If the railway ever returned, the empty land around those tracks could become the center of an entirely new town. Warehouses, factories, housing for workers, restaurants, shops, all the things that naturally appeared when transportation created opportunity. But there was one problem. No one else believed it would happen. And because of that, Lucas knew he had a small window of time. A window where land along the railway was still cheap enough to buy. Over the next few months, Lucas began doing something that surprised everyone in Stonebridge Valley. He started buying land along the abandoned railway. At first, people assumed it was a mistake. Some thought he was simply buying farmland. Others believed he was planning some small warehouse project. But the truth was much bigger than that. Lucas wasn't buying a single property. He was buying entire sections of land. Old stations, empty fields beside the tracks, abandoned industrial lots. Piece by piece, he slowly built ownership along several miles of the railway route. Soon, people began talking about it. At the small diner in town where locals gathered every morning, the conversation came up again and again. Did you hear what Lucas bought this week? More railway land. Someone laughed. What's he planning to build there? Another man shrugged. A museum for trains that never come. The old railway had been silent for 20 years. Most people believed it would stay that way forever. But Lucas kept buying, because he believed something few others understood. Transportation changes the future of land faster than almost anything else. And if the trains ever return to Stonebridge Valley, the forgotten railway might become the most important place in the entire region. The only question was whether Lucas had made the smartest investment of his life, or the biggest mistake. And that answer depended on something no one in the valley could control: whether the trains would ever come back. For the next year, Lucas Mercer continued buying land along the abandoned railway. Quietly, carefully. While most investors chased property near the busy highways, Lucas focused only on one thing: the forgotten railway corridor running across Stonebridge Valley. By the end of the year, he owned more than anyone realized. Several miles of land beside the tracks, an old freight loading yard, 2 abandoned train stations, and dozens of acres of empty fields surrounding the railway. But owning the land was only the beginning, because Lucas wasn't waiting for the railway to return. He was preparing for it, and that decision confused almost everyone who watched what he did next. One morning, construction equipment appeared beside the old railway tracks. Bulldozers cleared weeds that had grown around the rusted rails for decades. Workers repaired access roads leading toward the abandoned stations. Survey teams placed markers across the empty land. At first, people assumed Lucas was simply cleaning the property. But the work didn't stop. Within weeks, the first building appeared. It was not a house. It was not a farm. It was a warehouse. A large metal structure built only a short distance from the railway line. The location puzzled everyone in the valley. There were no trains, no transportation, no reason for a warehouse to exist there. And yet Lucas continued building. A second warehouse followed, then a storage facility, then a truck loading yard. By the end of the summer, the empty land beside the abandoned railway looked completely different. Where weeds had once grown, there were now wide gravel roads, fenced industrial lots, and several newly built structures standing beside the tracks. From a distance, it almost looked like the beginning of a small industrial town. But there was still one problem. Nothing was happening there. No trains arrived. No companies moved in. And that made the entire project look strange. At the diner in Stonebridge Valley, the conversations became louder. Have you seen what Lucas is building out there? Warehouses beside a dead railway. A few men laughed. Maybe he thinks the trains are coming back tomorrow. Another man shook his head. That land has been empty for 20 years. And from the outside, their logic made sense. Lucas was spending money on buildings where there was no business activity, no freight shipments, no customers. Even some of Lucas's friends quietly questioned him. One evening, a neighbor stopped by Lucas's property while construction workers were finishing another building. He looked across the gravel roads and metal warehouses standing beside the silent railway. "Lucas," he said carefully, "you know there's still no plan to reopen this line, right?" Lucas nodded. "I know. So why build all this now?" Lucas looked toward the tracks stretching across the valley. Then he said something simple. "Because when the trains come back, it will already be too late. Most people build businesses after opportunity arrives. Lucas was building before it arrived. And that difference was what made everyone doubt him. But Lucas had studied enough history to understand something important. When transportation changes, land prices change instantly. If the railway reopened, developers would rush into the valley. Construction companies would buy every available piece of land near the tracks. And within months, the opportunity Lucas saw would disappear. But if the infrastructure was already there, the warehouses, the roads, the loading yards, companies looking for shipping locations might choose the place that was already prepared. So Lucas continued building, month after month. By the second year, the railway corridor had transformed even more. 3 large warehouses stood beside the tracks. A trucking depot opened near the entrance road. Lucas even built a small row of storefront buildings designed for restaurants and supply stores. Still, the trains never came. And that made the entire project look even more unusual. But something else was happening far beyond the valley. In government offices hundreds of miles away, transportation officials were finalizing plans for a new regional freight rail system. Industrial growth in nearby cities had increased demand for rail shipping again. And the old Stonebridge Railway was one of the most cost-effective routes to restore. The valley still didn't know it. The diners were still full of jokes about Lucas's empty town. But somewhere in the distance, decisions were being made that would soon change everything in Stonebridge Valley. And when the trains finally returned to the old railway, the land everyone ignored for 20 years might suddenly become the most valuable place in the region. The only question left was whether Lucas Mercer had prepared early enough. For nearly 2 years after Lucas Mercer began building beside the abandoned railway, Stonebridge Valley remained quiet. The warehouses stood beside the tracks. The gravel roads stretched across the empty fields. The loading yards waited, but the railway itself remained silent. No trains, no freight shipments, no activity. From a distance, Lucas's project still looked strange. A small industrial town built beside a railway that hadn't carried a train in decades. Some people in the valley had stopped talking about it entirely. Others simply assumed Lucas would eventually abandon the project. But Lucas never stopped preparing. He maintained the buildings. He kept the roads clear. He upgraded the electrical connections and loading platforms. To Lucas, the railway was not dead. It was simply waiting. Then one morning, something unexpected happened. A group of government engineers arrived in Stonebridge Valley. They were not there for Lucas's warehouses. They were there for the railway. Survey vehicles began moving along the old tracks. Inspection teams examined bridges and tunnels. And for the first time in 20 years, people in the valley saw activity on the railway line again. At first, no one understood what it meant. But the rumors spread quickly. The Regional Transportation Authority had approved a new freight corridor connecting several growing industrial cities. And the Stonebridge Railway had been selected as the main route through the valley. The tracks would be repaired. New signaling systems would be installed. And freight trains would begin operating again within the year. Suddenly, the entire valley was talking about the railway again. Land agents began receiving phone calls. Industrial companies started searching for property near the tracks. Developers drove through the valley looking for places to build warehouses and distribution centers. But they discovered something surprising. Most of the land along the railway was already owned by one person, Lucas Mercer. Even more surprising was what they found beside the tracks. Warehouses that were already built. Truck loading yards already connected to access roads. Industrial lots already prepared for businesses. Lucas had spent 2 years building infrastructure that companies now desperately needed. And the moment the railway reopening became official, everything changed. Within weeks, the first logistics company contacted Lucas. They needed a warehouse location connected directly to the railway line. Lucas already had one. Then another company arrived. Then another. Manufacturing firms looking for shipping facilities. Food distribution companies. Agricultural suppliers. Every one of them needed exactly what Lucas had prepared years earlier. By the time the railway construction crews finished repairing the tracks, Lucas's once empty warehouses were already leased. The small industrial zone beside the railway became busy almost overnight. Workers arrived. Delivery trucks lined the gravel roads. New buildings appeared beside the original warehouses. Restaurants and stores opened in the small row of storefronts Lucas had built. Within a year, the area had grown into something the valley had never expected. A new town. Freight trains began passing through the valley every day. The once silent railway station was repaired and reopened. And the empty land beside the tracks turned into one of the busiest transportation hubs in the region. People who had once laughed at Lucas now drove past his industrial town with disbelief. At the diner in Stonebridge Valley, the conversations were very different now. One man shook his head while watching trucks pass along the road. Lucas saw it before any of us did. Another nodded slowly. That railway looked dead to everyone. But he built a town around it. Land prices along the railway soared. Developers who had ignored the area for decades suddenly competed to buy property nearby. But most of the prime land was already taken. Lucas had bought it years earlier when no one else wanted it. One evening, as the sun set across Stonebridge Valley, Lucas stood beside the railway tracks watching a long freight train pass slowly through the town he had built. The metal wheels echoed across the valley as the train disappeared into the distance. A reporter visiting the new town asked Lucas the same question many people were asking. How did you know this would happen? Lucas smiled slightly. I didn't know. I just knew something important. Transportation always brings people. For generations, towns had grown around the same forces. Roads, ports, railways. And now the forgotten Stonebridge Railway had created a brand new community. Not because everyone believed in it, but because one man prepared for it before anyone else could see the opportunity. Sometimes the future doesn't arrive suddenly. Sometimes it moves quietly, waiting for someone patient enough to recognize it. And in Stonebridge Valley, an abandoned railway that everyone ignored for 20 years had become the center of a thriving town. All because one person looked at the same empty tracks and imagined something different.